Iran just intercepted a tanker in the Strait of Hormuz, and the real story isn't the cargo, it's about the message. Tehran is flexing its control over a global choke point that the world can't ignore. I'll explain what Iran did, and more importantly, the message that the mullahs are sending. Iran's military has seized a petrochemical tanker bound for Singapore, intercepting the vessel in Gulf waters and taking it into Iranian control. On the surface, it may look like just another maritime confrontation in a region that's accustomed to tension. But this one does stand out, not because of the ship or its cargo, but because of the message behind it. Tehran is clearly trying to remind everyone that it still has power and leverage in one of the world's most sensitive waterways, and it's willing to use that leverage when it chooses. According to reports, the vessel, called the Talara, was carrying petrochemicals from the United Arab Emirates to Singapore when it was intercepted. Iranian state media says the ship was seized under a, quote, judicial order for alleged violations involving its cargo. Now, they didn't say what those violations were. They frankly rarely do. What they did say, loudly, is that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy carried out the operation and that the seizure was intentional, justified, and lawful. Ah, well then, I don't know what folks are upset about. I mean, if the IRGC says that it's lawful, The details from the region suggest the ship was intercepted not far from the Strait of Hormuz. That's the narrow stretch of water where the Gulf meets the open ocean, and it's one of the most strategically important corridors on the planet. U.S. Central Command, which oversees troops in the region, said in a statement that it was aware of the incident and actively monitoring the situation. It added that, quote, commercial vessels are entitled to largely unimpeded rights of navigation. Now, it's not the first time that Iran has done this. It's carried out similar seizures in and around that area, sometimes claiming safety violations, sometimes accusing ships of smuggling, and occasionally offering no explanation at all. The Jerusalem Post notes something important. Iran had scaled back these kinds of seizures recently, which makes the timing here seem, well, more deliberate. This appears to be signaling. The mullahs in the IRGC sending a message. Tehran is telling the world that even in its weakened state, it can still project power when it wants to. That no matter what diplomatic or economic pressure it faces, it retains a form of leverage that most countries simply don't have. Because geography is power, in a sense, and Iran happens to sit beside one of the most valuable pieces of geography anywhere on Earth. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how important the Strait of Hormuz really is. It's a choke point, only a few miles wide in certain places. Nearly a fifth of all global oil passes through that narrow corridor every single day. Now, tankers and gas carriers, and chemical shipments, you name it. If you shut down the Strait of Hormuz, even temporarily, the global economy feels it immediately. Prices rise, insurance premiums spike, shipping routes reroute or stall, and energy markets lurch. Tehran knows this, and they know that the mere threat of disruption is often enough to get the world's attention. That's why Iran doesn't need a vast fleet of warships or massive naval deployments. It doesn't need a blue water navy. All it needs is the willingness to create uncertainty, to raise the temperature just enough to remind everyone that it has the ability to impact global trade. As mentioned, Iran has done this before, multiple times. Tanker seizures in 2019, or the incidents, of course, in 2023 involving commercial vessels linked to Western firms. These operations tend to follow a familiar pattern. A seizure or an interception, a claim of legal justification, the crew gets detained, the cargo's confiscated, and the international community complains. It's a pressure tactic, an asymmetric tool that fits well with the IRGC's doctrine. So you ask yourself, what happens now? Well, the vessel is likely being held while Iran investigates the alleged violations. The crew will undoubtedly be questioned. The cargo might be seized, inspected, or redirected. Regionally, we should expect more naval activity. The U.S. Fifth Fleet monitors this area, and incidents like this often lead to heightened patrols, increased surveillance, and, of course, diplomatic pressure on Tehran to release the ship. Gulf states like the UAE and Saudi Arabia tend to view these actions as direct challenges to maritime security. Well, because they are. All right, a quick reminder. Remember to check out our YouTube channel. Just stop on by YouTube and search for President's Daily Brief. That's YouTube at President's Daily Brief. And if you're so inclined, and I hope you are, please hit the subscriber button. And as always, if you want to listen to the show ad-free, consider becoming a premium member at pdbpremium.com. Okay, coming up after the break. Washington may skip the disarmament phase to restart Gaza reconstruction. And China is stirring regional tensions by sending Coast Guard vessels through Japan-administered waters. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here, and I've got some breaking news from our friends over at Beam. Beam's cyber sale is now open for early access for PDB listeners. That's right. And it's their best offer of the year, but only for 48 hours. Right now, you can get up to 50% off. And with my code MIKE, that's M-I-K-E, you can grab Beam's Dream Powder for just $32.50. And if my math is correct, that's only $1.08 per night for the best sleep of your life. Dream is packed with ingredients that your body actually needs to sleep. Reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin. Dosed intelligently, and not like that drugstore stuff that can leave you groggy. Go to shopbeam.com/Mike and use code Mike and get up to 50% off during Beam's cyber sale. You can grab Dream for just $32.50, but here's the catch. It's only available at this price until it sells out. So seriously, think about it. How much would you pay for a truly great night of sleep? With Beam, it's just $1.08 a night. And that, my friends, is a dream bargain. Welcome back to the PDB. The Trump administration is rethinking the order of its Gaza peace plan, and that rethink may create havoc for the enclave's reconstruction plan. Israeli security officials say the proposal from Washington would postpone the international force meant to disarm Hamas, a shift that they warn contradicts the core of President Trump's 20-point peace plan and risks creating a dangerous power vacuum in the enclave. Well, not really a power vacuum, since you could count on an armed Hamas to reassert itself. Washington's idea sparked what security officials called a, quote, deadlock in talks between the two countries since then. According to one official who spoke to Jerusalem's Channel 13, quote, there can be no rehabilitation before demilitarization. Gaza must be demilitarized, end quote. Israeli government leaders argue that U.S. efforts to fast-track reconstruction risk leaving Hamas on a platform, potentially allowing the terror group to easily rearm under the guise of orchestrating humanitarian aid. One senior Israeli official told Channel 13, quote, the interim situation is the worst there is. Hamas has been strengthening in recent weeks since the end of the war. As we've been tracking here on the PDB, the White House, acting as guarantor of the agreement, submitted a draft resolution to the UN Security Council that includes the full text of Trump's 20-point peace plan, the same framework that Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu endorsed in September alongside the president. The resolution is expected to come up for a vote at the Security Council today, a step that Washington sees as critical to solidifying international support for the plan. The draft calls for establishing an international stabilization force with a mandate through 2027, empowering member states to secure and administer Gaza until a new governing authority can take over. As longtime PDB listeners will know, several Arab and Muslim-majority countries, including Qatar, Egypt, the UAE, Indonesia, and Pakistan, voiced support for the U.S.-led resolution, donating troops to the force, calling it a, quote, pathway to Palestinian self-determination. Israel has begun preparing for the possible arrival of thousands of foreign troops, though officials in Jerusalem insist that any such force must have the authority to disarm terrorist groups and not just merely serve as peacekeepers. On the ground, however, the situation tells a different story. In Gaza, Hamas reasserted control over areas vacated by Israel since the ceasefire took hold in early October. Gazans have accused the Iran-backed terror group of executing accused collaborators with Israel, imposing new fees on goods, and tightening its oversight of trade. They say Hamas authorities are monitoring everything entering the Strip, levying charges on imported fuel and cigarettes, and price gouging. A Gaza mall owner told reporters that Hamas officials have been, quote, touring around, checking goods, and setting prices, end quote. Of course, Hamas authorities deny the accusations. Oh, do they? The head of the terror group's media office said Hamas is only handling urgent humanitarian aid and administrative tasks and remains ready to hand over power to a technocratic transitional government once the UN approves Trump's plan. Yes, of course they do. But witnesses in the enclave tell a story of a terror group looking to reassert power. Still, Israel and the Palestinian Authority remain divided on who should take the reins in the event that Hamas at some point actually steps down. The PA, led by Mahmoud Abbas's Fatah movement, is pressing for a role in the new administration, a demand that Netanyahu firmly opposes, arguing that Fatah's return will only open the door to renewed instability. In the end, the Trump administration is trying to rebuild faster than Hamas can rearm or increase their holdings of weapons, because they never have disarmed. Race, Israel insists, cannot be won without stripping the terror group of its weapons first. This, by the way, the entire situation is actually the definition of a goat rope. You can look that up in the dictionary. Goat rope, and it will have this situation listed. Now, don't get me wrong. The desire to get started with reconstruction in Gaza is noble, it's righteous, and it's well-intentioned. But trying to do that while at the same time an armed Hamas rebuilds its influence in the enclave and continues to screw over the citizens in Gaza who would actually like a better life, well, that's a fool's errand. And trying to convince Arab states and others, who, by the way, have done little to nothing over decades to actually help the citizens of Gaza, convincing them to move into Gaza and disarm Hamas and keep them from getting their hands on the billions of dollars in aid that will flow into Gaza, well, that's also a fool's errand. And to convince Israel to allow the Palestinian Authority, which, by the way, is hated by much of Gaza, to try and assume control in the enclave, well, you see where I'm going with this. So, is there a bright spot here? If you're pragmatic and realistic, the answer is no. This hopeful talk about reconstruction and peace and Hamas stepping aside, it reminds me of our recent history in Afghanistan. Back in the early days of the global war on terror, when hopeful people in Washington talked about bringing some form of a pseudo-democratic government to Kabul. Look, never say never, and hope is a good thing. But when it comes to Gaza and resolving the Hamas/Iran issue, imagine something that's very, very, very difficult, and then double that degree of difficulty. And on that cheery note, shifting over to the East China Sea, after Japan's new prime minister suggested that a Chinese attack on Taiwan would trigger a military response from Tokyo, Beijing responded by dispatching Coast Guard vessels to an island chain that both capitals claim on a so-called rights enforcement patrol. China's foreign ministry wasted little time turning the remarks into a political confrontation. The ministry issued a statement demanding Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi walk them back, insisting her military comments made in Parliament earlier this month amounted to meddling in China's, quote, internal affairs. The Chinese Coast Guard said as a result, its, quote, Vessel 1307 formation entered the Japan-administered waters around what China calls the Diaoyu Islands, known in Japan as the Senkaku Islands, on what they called a routine lawful mission. That's the kind of language that Beijing rolls out whenever it wants to signal resolve without admitting that the move is political. But the timing made the message unmistakable. This was retaliation for the comments, and it showed how quickly Beijing reaches for maritime pressure when it feels even slightly challenged. And the diplomatic fallout only accelerated from there. China's foreign ministry summoned Japan's ambassador in what was its first formal protest in more than 2 years, while the Chinese consul general in Osaka, Japan, ignited outrage with a social media post that read, quote, "The dirty head that sticks itself out must be cut off," end quote. Well, that post has since been deleted, but Tokyo lodged a formal complaint with Beijing's foreign ministry, as you might imagine, labeling the rhetoric as unacceptable. China then widened the pressure campaign. The foreign ministry warned citizens against traveling to Japan, citing a vague security risk. With Chinese tourists making up nearly 1/5 of all foreign tourists, Tokyo saw an immediate threat. 3 Chinese airlines also announced that tickets to Japan could be refunded or changed free of charge, in tandem with the ministry's travel warning. How big of them? Meanwhile, China's military pressure campaign around Taiwan kept grinding on. Taiwan's defense ministry said it tracked 30 Chinese military aircraft and 7 Navy vessels around the Democratic Island over the weekend, just the latest round of what Taipei calls CCP patrols meant to test its defenses. Beijing's foreign ministry later confirmed its military had been carrying out another, quote, joint combat patrol, noting that Taiwan scrambled aircraft and deployed ships to monitor activity. Now, I want to point out that Japan has long followed a policy of strategic ambiguity, avoiding explicit commitments to defend Taiwan. But Takaichi's comments, which linked a potential Chinese attack to a, quote, survival-threatening situation under Japanese law, marked a subtle shift, one that Beijing immediately seized upon. Even after the Japanese prime minister insisted that her comments did not represent a policy shift, CCP officials and state media treated them as proof that Tokyo's working with the U.S. to contain China's rise. Beijing pushed the line even harder, portraying Japan as little more than an echo of Washington, a narrative that, frankly, lets the CCP frame Tokyo as part of a U.S.-led containment strategy of an independent actor. As for the Senkaku Islands, well, they've long been a fault line between Asia's two largest powers, shaped by wartime grievances dating back to Japan's occupation of China during World War II, and a deep reservoir of mistrust that never fully receded. All right, coming up in the back of the brief, fresh developments in the energy corruption scandal gripping Kyiv, with a look at what Zelenskyy is now doing in response. I'll have that when we come back. Hey, Mike Baker here. Now, not to stress you out, but Thanksgiving is right around the corner. And now, one of the great things about Thanksgiving, one of the things I love about it, is that it's one of the few times in the year that we can all slow down, gather as families, and remind ourselves of what we're thankful for, right? It's about gratitude, not just for the past, but for the future that we're building. The great team at Tri-Tails Premium Beef, they understand that. These folks are terrific. They're a fifth-generation ranching family in Texas, raising cattle the right way and shipping the best-tasting beef right to your door. And just in time for Thanksgiving, they've created what they call the Thankful Box, built for this season, to help you create the amazing meals that bring people together. It's more than a holiday meal. It's a way to feed your legacy. And let's be honest, nobody is going to be upset if there's a little less turkey on the Thanksgiving table and a little more beef. Find it now at trybeef.com/PDB. Again, that's trybeef.com/PDB. In today's back of the brief, Ukraine's energy corruption scandal isn't fading, and President Zelenskyy knows it. Over the weekend, he rolled out a new plan to clean house across the sector, a move meant to show that Kyiv is tightening controls, even as investigators uncover more about the $100 million scheme that's rocking its nuclear industry. Zelenskyy laid out the plan after a Sunday sit-down with the prime minister, a meeting that, by his telling, was as much about restoring public trust as it was about reorganizing agencies. He's now asking lawmakers to sweep out the leadership of the State Nuclear Regulatory Inspectorate and the State Energy Supervision Inspectorate, two bodies that are now under fresh scrutiny as the scandal widens. In addition, Zelenskyy wants Parliament to reboot the Asset Recovery Management Agency and finish choosing its new director by year's end. That's a timeline that signals the Ukrainian president wants to be seen as being in no mood for bureaucratic drift. In tandem, he's also ordering a full audit of assets tied to Russian entities or collaborators who fled the country, arguing that those holdings should be working for Ukraine's defense, not sitting frozen on a balance sheet as the war grinds on. All of this is unfolding as the energy scandal continues to sprawl. As we've been tracking, Timur Mindich, once a business partner of Zelenskyy's and co-owner of his production company, is accused by anti-corruption watchdogs of orchestrating the $100 million scheme. Investigators say he relied on a network of loyalists inside the state nuclear operator who pressed contractors for kickbacks as high as 15% in exchange for greenlighting work meant to protect power plants from Russian strikes. As we've previously mentioned, Mindich slipped out of the country just as anti-corruption agents were closing in, a perfectly timed exit that's, of course, fueled speculation that he knew what was coming. While Zelenskyy hasn't been tied to the scheme, the scandal has intensified the broader ongoing question hanging over Kyiv. Can Ukraine police its own corruption while asking the West for billions in aid? And the clock is ticking. Winter is closing in. Russian strikes on the grid are ramping up, and Ukraine can't afford doubts about who's running its energy sector and if they have clean hands. And that, my friends, is the President's Daily Brief for Monday, the 17th of November. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And I hope you had a chance to catch our latest episode of the PDB Situation Report over the weekend. If not, just head on over to YouTube and go to @President's Daily Brief, or you can find it wherever you get your podcast stuff. I'm Mike Baker, and I'll be back later today with the PDB Afternoon Bulletin. Until then, stay informed, stay safe, stay cool. Hey, Mike Baker here. Now, let me take just a moment to talk about personal finances. As I suspect you already realize, right? I think you know this. The holidays are going to be here before you know it. And for many families, well, of course, that means excitement, but also perhaps a little stress. Look, between gifts and travel and higher prices, it is easy to feel overwhelmed, especially if you're already relying on credit cards to cover the basics. So if that debt is piling up, well, you're not alone. Now, if you're a homeowner, perhaps you already considered reaching out to our friends at American Financing, but maybe hesitated because you don't want to give up your low mortgage rate. And that's why the folks at American Financing created what they call the Smart Equity Loan. It's a simple, smart way to get your finances back on track without giving up your low mortgage rate. Unlike a HELOC, which can fluctuate with the market, the Smart Equity Loan offers a fixed rate, and so you only have one predictable monthly payment. It lets you use your home's equity to pay off high-interest debt, free up your cash flow, and still keep your existing mortgage intact. There's no upfront fees. That's important. And to find out if you qualify, just call 866-885-1881. That number again, 866-885-1881. Or visit americanfinancing.net/PDB.
Hey, thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and leave a comment, a really positive, nice, and kind comment. That would be appreciated. And if you're not already subscribed to our channel, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our daily updates.